last thing I'll say, J-Dad, I apologize for screwing around on you. I just wish you would have handled it a different way. You know, obviously it don't mean so. You have a nice life.
911, state police.
Yeah, someone just killed my girlfriend, or my friend, at Smith Grove, and he just pulled off in a gray truck.
He shot her?
Yes, she's dead. She is dead.
What's your girlfriend's name, hon?
Debbie Reduce.
What's his name?
Randall. He's the ex-police officer, I think.
A sheriff's deputy from Kentucky is accused of killing his girlfriend. Kentucky police say Randall Creek murdered his girlfriend at her Kentucky home on Sunday night. On Monday, Kentucky authorities suspected he was in Iowa.
Hey, Mark, it's Randall. I'll let you go. I won't be working with you anymore, brother. I shot my ex-girlfriend. I'm sure she's dead. Lied to me, and now she's dead. Got some bad news for you. Thought me and my girl was going to get back together. She's been lying to me all time. Well, I shot the in the back of the head. So I put 2 or 3 in her chest, 1 in the back of the head.
After fleeing Kentucky, Randall Creek stopped at the North Liberty Library to taunt police officers who were looking for him nearly 500 miles away. He emailed saying he wasn't going to put up a fight. However, he was going to make the Kentucky State Police earn their money.
As he's fled Kentucky, he leaves breadcrumbs all along the way for law enforcement, taunting them, giving them clues. But there's an arrogance about how he does this. He doesn't sound concerned, he doesn't sound upset, and ultimately what Randall Creek is saying is, this is about me. Let me tell you how I got wronged. Let me tell you how I had no choice but to take this person out.
Investigators back in Kentucky traced Creek to North Liberty and then alerted officers in eastern Iowa. 30 minutes later, police found his truck at a hotel in Evansdale.
I don't know how you guys are perceived by your peers, but everybody that met me over the last 10 or 20 years, they would tell you they thought I would be where I'm at right now. Really? Oh, yeah. They thought that I was a killer 20 years ago. And it's just because of my persona, I guess, you know? But like I said, I guarantee if you interviewed 100 people right now, I knew this was going to happen. They just didn't know it was going to be a girl. They figured it'd be a guy.
The fact that Creek would self-disclose this makes you wonder, like, what is it about him? Is he somebody that's been wearing a mask, essentially looking and appearing to the public one way as a law-abiding law enforcement officer, but in reality, he's really somebody very different? How much of this is also his inflated ego and trying to present himself as somebody who's particularly cold and a killer?
You want to go by you ask questions, or you want me to start from the beginning, or what do you want to do?
I personally think it's better if you start from the beginning.
I dated this girl for 5 years, okay? Debbie Radice. I've been divorced since 1995. I saw her at a nightclub, and I was pretty drunk. Next thing you know, we started dating and stuff, and everything was good, man, and first couple of years was really good. We never were talking about marriage or anything at that point. Well, the 3rd year, going on the 4th, is when she started getting really serious and let's talk about our future. She had a couple of grandchildren and stuff, and I ain't gonna lie to you, man, I was not ready to be a grandfather. But I knew that the summer of 2008, if I didn't marry this girl, it was coming to an end. So all my buddies are 30 to 35. So what happens? They all get married. They got little babies now. I've already been there, done it. Everybody's kind of gone their separate. But my best friend, like I said, he just left me.
What we know about people with maladaptive or negative personality traits is behind their presentation, their grandiosity, their overinflated sense of self-importance. They're fragile, they're weak, they fear being abandoned. And with Randall Creek, we see this pattern. He has this expectation that people are gonna drop everything for him. And to not do that, to not meet his needs, he starts to have problems regulating his own impulse control. Very quickly, his ego comes to its knees. He has a difficult time not being the center of attention.
And come to find out now, later, she'd been thinking about splitting with me for several months. I told her, I said, you need to break up with me. I said, you need to tell me if we're breaking up. She goes, yeah, I guess we are. But here's where the snag. So the next thing you know, I start missing her. I still had feelings for the girl. And in her mind, it was too late. I said, look, let's try to make it work. I said, because I thought we'd just be friends. And so we started going out to lunch about once a week. She would still kiss me, hug me. And after about a month, I just told her, I said, look, Dave, this is tough for me. I love you to death. I didn't realize I loved you as much as I do until now. And we started looking at rings. Well, that wasn't good enough. She goes, Randall, why didn't you do this 6 months ago? So anyway, when she shot me down on the rings, I'm thinking, damn, maybe this girl, she's moved on.
Creek is providing a motive as he's talking here. You get the sense he's feeling misled, or he's confused because they're meeting once a week for lunch, she's kissing him and hugging him. Individuals with psychopathy have a difficult time reading the room in regards to emotions. For Creek, that is the ultimate slap in the face. It's the rejection. And unlike the average individual who might be disappointed about a rejection, individuals with psychopathy may ruminate on that rejection. And that rumination just fuels their anger and desires for vindication.
But this is where she got in trouble. So that particular week, I was depressed. Sending her flowers, all this stuff, cards, nice cards, all kinds of things that I don't normally do. I started sending everything that I'm not all about. We can have a good life. And then a couple days, I either couldn't get a hold of her, she went ice cold. So Friday the 26th, I had a bag packed. I emptied my bank account out. I was heading to Anchorage, Alaska. And I just knocked on her door. I said, look, she hadn't answered my calls for a couple days, which I wasn't one of these stalker type guys.
He initially says, I'm doing all the things that I don't normally do, like give flowers and cards and gifts. And he's doing it a lot now. That's called love bombing. All of it was hollow. Everything that he did was simply to try to keep the victim around because that's what psychopaths do. He's going to now do something dramatic. On its face, it looks like I'm emptying out my bank accounts and packing up all my stuff and I'm going to Anchorage, Alaska. But the reality is that he already planned to murder her, and his plan was to kill her and then escape to Alaska. That was what he wanted to do.
I knock on her door. I said, I just want to let you know, since me and you obviously you're not going to work out, then I'm leaving. Well, worst thing she could ever do is invite me in. We have sex. It wasn't sex, we were making love.
About what the other person wants. It's not about the relationship, it's about their needs exclusively.
So anyway, I call her Saturday afternoon, no message, no answer.
It's about 10 after 10 on Saturday evening, heading to work, smoking beer, drawing myself. Bye. Hey, it's me. It's now 11:30 on Saturday evening. Hey, didn't know if you may want to go to church in the morning.
He tells police officers that he's willing to accept this idea that she needs some space. But in reality, he doesn't give her any space at all. He's already love-bombed her, and now, even though he's not a stalker, he's leaving incessant voicemail after voicemail. They happen so frequently that it becomes stalker. It becomes scary. For a woman, these kinds of behaviors are red flags. For the psychopath, they're just normal everyday business.
So I tried again about midnight, okay? Approximately, midnight. Well, next thing you know, the phone's busy. So I didn't hear from her on the cell phone. I probably called 3 times on that. Tried 3 or 4 times on that. And I got a busy signal. Still didn't hear nothing. All right, now Randall's getting suspicious. It was like she was living a double life. Worst thing a woman can ever do is give a man some hope. So next thing you know, I was cruising down 31, and I'm getting pissed at that point. I pull up, I roll in, and there's a red Corvette there. And I saw the Corvette, and I was like, oh, I can't compete with it. I got a Ford pickup. You know what I mean? He's probably got some money. So anyway, I knock on the door. I'm pissed. I was in uniform. I was in the vest, the whole package. So I had my gun on my side. If that spare key would have been there and I saw that car, I'd have went in. And I'd have probably shot both of them. Straight up.
For him, that level of frustration gets to a point where now he has to exact blame. He has to exact revenge. He has to do a physical act in order to get that power and control back because he's been so deeply wounded. And that's the fragility of the narcissism that we're talking about. Because his psychopathy is so fueled by narcissism, any wound in of itself is going to have an outburst, right? His behaviors are going to be so overblown as a result.
And she finally got up, came in. See, this is where she up. She thought she was going to come out and we were going to have a conversation. Well, we've had enough conversations, okay? Well, you ever have a girl look at you and you just know she's lying? You just know, this is lying. So she comes out, and she's real cold-natured, She had her little house coat on, and she came in there by the truck. And I said, what are you doing? I said, why did he stay all night? I said, why did you guys have sex? And she goes, I didn't sleep with him.
This is off my driveway?
Oh, yeah. I don't know if you've ever been involved in a shooting. I don't know if you have, but you shake a little bit. I was in combat, but a handgun's a little different. I know I was probably shaking like that. And I knew there was one in the chamber. I never have hit a woman. I never slapped a lady. I've never done it. But I've seen a lot of death. You know what I'm saying? And so she turned her back on me and leaned on my truck. Like I felt like I was just ignored and lied to, and she didn't want to face me.
Dismissing.
I feel disrespected. And so when she turned her back against me and leaned over on that damn thing, something just kicked in and boom, there it was.
Creek is now blaming the victim. He's justifying his behaviors, and he felt disrespected. There is also a clear lack of remorse as Creek is speaking. And we know that individuals with psychopathy don't have the same emotional attachment to relationships as the average individual. And in this case, there's no point in the interview that Creek has talked about feeling bad, feeling guilty, or regretting what he did. If anything, he's justified his actions.
I just remember boom, boom. And I saw her moving. And I'm thinking, well, if I'm already in this deep, we're going to put a couple more in her. So I think I put 2 or 3 or 4 rounds in her chest.
Where do you think the first shot hurt?
First shot was behind the head. I think that killed her. And the way she dropped, like you shot a deer before? I don't want to claim a human person like a deer, but it looked kind of like the same concept when you made a really good shot on a deer. Well, in the back of the head, it's a pretty good shot. I'll tell you what's bad is I thought it was going to ricochet. And it was right there on concrete, so I'm thinking, damn, I'm only going to shoot. Because if she had been over in the grass, hell, I may have emptied the whole damn clip on.
How far away from you do you think when you first shot her in the back there?
As close as possible. After that went down, old dude comes out. And I'm like, you gotta me. Had a mullet. I'm talking the old 1985 mullet. I'm like, you gotta be me. I'm competing against Billy Ray Cyrus.
Every single decision, every single behavior that she did was the absolute wrong one in his mind. And because of that, she needed to be taught a lesson. Several bullets worth of a lesson. And when the man comes out, you can see the level of animosity that he has. This is the only real time that we get any real kind of emotionality. He's more offended that this man is less of a man than him, than he is at being shameful and feeling guilty that he took another person's life.
Saw me and he went back in the house. Yeah, I believe everybody gets a lucky day from time to time, and that was his lucky day. Out of the 2 women that I one of them I shot, I should have shot the other one. You know what I'm saying? And I almost did years ago, but it just didn't happen. Because she was just a, you know what I mean? Like this one wasn't really a, this one just chose to move on.
That dynamic of power and control we see in DV perpetrators all the time. Things have to be on their terms. It's my way or the highway. And in the case of Randall Creek, he's not actually any different than every other criminal who's in prison for killing a spouse or killing a partner, but he has this ongoing need to put himself on a pedestal. And his choice of how to do it is to say, people aren't going to be surprised that I did this. It's as if Creek wants to live up to this reputation that he's a bad boy, that he's a rebel somehow. And all he really is a criminal who didn't get caught before now.
Baltimore County 911.
Yes, ma'am. We need police and ambulance assistance. It seems John's on the couch. It looks like he's hurt. I'm not sure what's wrong with him. Oh, it looks like there's blood coming out of his nose.
Is he conscious?
I don't believe so.
And no one else is on with him?
I'm not sure. I dropped his children off, and his children came outside, and they said, come inside. There's something wrong. And this is all I don't know. It's kind of scary.
The details don't seem real. Police say Nicholas went to a friend's home and spent the night. He came back home Saturday evening around 5.
He came back out the house, told the friends that he found his father dead inside. 911 was called. Police responded, found the father dead on the ground floor, his mother dead in a bedroom upstairs, and his 2 brothers dead upstairs, all dead from gunshot wounds.
Talk about your dad. What do you do for a living?
Lawyer.
What kind of lawyer?
He's a business lawyer.
How about mom?
She had a property management sort of side business, more of a stay-at-home mom.
Oh, that's cool. Cool. You get along with them okay?
Great.
What's remarkable in just looking at how Nicholas Browning appears in the police interview, looking at his body language, looking at his demeanor, is that it's really unusual to see a teenager who's saying he had a great relationship with his parents not looking distraught over discovering that everybody in his family's dead. You'd at least expect somebody just trying to get their emotions under control with the realization that their family's completely gone. And we don't see any of that. He doesn't care that his family's dead. So there's no emotional undercurrent.
At this point, Browning's sort of offering up this lack of responsibility excuse where he's saying he was gonna go joyriding, oh, silly him, or dumb him. Like he's not that smart. He's this naive 15-year-old that doesn't know much. He's manipulating the narrative, controlling how the officers see him. That's his way of maintaining control of this entire situation.
And in the course of this, I've been calling my parents all day and they hadn't picked up, so.
Okay. So you guys get to back home. What happened then?
Then I opened the garage door. I walked inside and I saw my father on the couch, and that's sort of okay.
What did you see about that? I know stuff, but what did you see?
I saw he was on the couch and there was blood coming from his face.
Okay, what did you do after that?
Then we talked to him and he came in the house. He called 911. Then I went upstairs with the rest of my mother and my two brothers. I saw them.
The detective recognizes that describing this scene is going to be emotionally taxing. The only movement that Browning does is move his hand to describe the situation. He is not distressed at all. There is nothing disturbing about that scene to Browning, for a lot of reasons. Primarily, it's because he had already seen his father bloodied and shot in the head and on that couch. And the other element is his psychopathy, how he is getting further and further detached from his own humanity.
I've been a cop a long time. I've been homicide. I've been here a while. Stuff's just not adding up for me right now. I think you had something to do with what happened tonight. I think that you killed your family. Your family.
All a facade. He can't even get the emotion up to really put a full-throated defense of himself. He is not demonstrating that he is enjoying anything that's happening. But he's also not putting on any theatrics. He's not putting on a mask of someone who, I should be offended by any of this. He wants the detectives to think that he's young. He wants the detectives to think that he's not really capable of this level of violence, even though the keys to the gun safe are found under his mattress. I mean, literally, this guy did not care if he got caught. It's just, yeah, I know, because that's where I left him. And that's it. End of story.
There's no reason for me to kill. I love them. They provide me with everything I want. Yes, they're strict on me, so what? They don't ground me when they find me with alcohol. They're harsh, but they're not that harsh really. I mean, they let me do what I want. There's no, no reason. I love them.
They're dead.
I mean,
Yeah, about you. No doubt in my mind. Your brothers didn't do it. A burglar didn't do it.
how can you be certain?
We're 100% certain that nobody broke into that house.
Because we know. Not God, you don't have cameras in my house.
It's all staged. Every one of us has seen a real burglary.
Like, you probably get pretty freaked out once you've killed somebody.
This doesn't work that way. Number one, burglars don't kill their victims. I have a feeling that the gun, the 9mm, could be the one that's missing from the house.
There's definitely some traits of narcissism here. Traits of narcissism are part of psychopathy, and he thinks that he's smarter than police. And when he finds out that he might not be, he's sort of trying to wait the police out and information gather so he can create and spin like a new narrative that's also very manipulative. You know, traits consistent with narcissism and psychopathy. And that's something, you know, that threatens Browning's ego to be not smarter than the police.
You haven't shed one tear for your family.
You were totally unemotional about this. You walk into a house, your whole family's murdered. And you're just, I didn't do it. Why would I do it? I was in my friend's house.
So crying would make you believe that?
I think you're trying to convince yourself. You're doing a terrible job of convincing me.
I have to convince you.
Yeah, you do. Believe it or not, you do.
You're just lying. You're digging yourself deeper into a hole. You're 15 years old. You will spend the rest of your life in jail.
And if I tell you a reason that'll somehow change my jail sentence?
No, it gives us something to tell your neighbors, your family.
I do think he was trying to demonstrate his level of intellectual superiority. Him saying, you know, me telling you a story or me crying, those things are definitely the glibness associated with psychopathy. I do think that this is a challenge. He's growing more emboldened to challenge. He's still not experiencing any emotions though, right? He's still sitting there coolly, calmly. He's still kind of whispering. He's still getting the attention that he wants.
Where's this gun gonna be found?
No. It's for you guys to find.
I like that.
What? That is.
I'm looking in the eyes of a stone cold killer. There's no remorse. You haven't shed a tear. That's why I think there may not have been a reason. Maybe you are just a stone cold killer.
What happened? Nick, what happened? Come on, man. I can tell you didn't plan this.
Just because you're a father?
Yeah, it was the...
Was it physical?
No, it's more sort of like a... last, probably still, I mean, it was they were physical, I'm in a Boy Scouts, right, Life Scout, and then there's this leadership weekend, camp out, whatever thing, and, you know, I didn't want to go, you know, I'm almost done, didn't need a leadership camp, so my attitude wasn't great on the trip.
You got pissed?
So he got pissed. He hit me.
Was he beating on you too, mentally, or?
It was mentally, and you know, it's like he called me a lot of times.
So a common tactic that police will use in their interrogations is to validate, you know, the emotions of what's going on with the perpetrator. That usually will make them open up and say, "Oh yes, you understand me." And Browning takes that little carrot, making himself out to be sort of the victim in the story. He's really trying to distance himself from any responsibility in the crime.
I went back to get the car, and I saw him sitting on the couch. The TV was on, and the gun was out on the workshop bench.
What happened?
I walked up.
He was sleeping?
Yeah. Standing over him. And then I went between putting the gun up to his head and pulling it back down and up.
Did you have a pillow up too? Or?
Yeah, just the gun. The gun was... I'm not sure if I meant to pull the trigger or if it...
Just went off.
He's trying to cry. He's got some tears. He keeps holding his hand up over his eyes, and now in the role of being a victimized kid, he gets a gun and he's going to shoot his dad, but he hesitates. He's not sure if he pulled the trigger. He's shifting in the story. He's still a victim, but it's meant to convey that this wasn't premeditated. In fact, we know it was when we look at the evidence, hiding the keys in order to get the gun. But this is a new strategy to manipulate the police. He's figured by now they don't believe his story that he didn't do it, so he might as well give them a story where he did it.
Couldn't just walk away from that. And then I shot my mom. And then
She's still sleeping?
yeah, I waited for a little bit, then I think she went back to sleep. I shot her. And I shot her.
Why the brothers, man?
I thought no one was there to say anything that my story would go, because I'm the only one.
Do you remember where you shot your dad? I wasn't in there. On his body.
On the head.
How about your mom?
The head.
Your brothers too, then?
The head.
Why'd you do that?
I figured it'd be quicker, but, just be instant.
I think he shot his father, and then he waited to see if it would stir anybody. When it didn't, he recognized that he was probably gonna have to put a little bit more effort. And I think him shooting them in the head, I think was an element of him being offended that they made him put in so much work. There's nothing about this that says that he is sorry for killing his family. They were objects that kept getting in his way, and at 15 years old, he wanted it his way or the highway.
What happened with the jewelry and the Xbox?
I opened up the jewelry case, threw some on the ground, and moved the Xbox and the Wii to the pool table. And then...
How'd you leave? Through the back door?
The back door. And I just threw the gun on the side of the road.
Did you notice there was anybody outside?
I was so out of it, I wouldn't have noticed if someone was standing there. There might have been somebody, but...
He's still being manipulative. He wasn't out of it at all. He figured out which door, where to leave some footprints. He had gloves. He knew where the keys were. He hid the keys. He phoned his friends in the morning, and they decided to go out. These aren't the actions of a frightened teenager who's just acting on impulse. These are the actions of someone who has forethought, intent, planning. So we see the behaviors and actions of a psychopath on full display.
We've sent some officers to go look for the gun. If we can't find it, we may ask you to come out. You know there's that many kids live in that neighborhood. I don't want someone finding it. You know, that would be worse.
That would kill me. I couldn't handle it.
You know there are lesser charges, right? You know there's manslaughter. You're a smart kid. You know there's second-degree murder. You know all this. But I don't know why things happen. The only thing I have right now is 4 dead people. My only recourse right now is first-degree murder. If there's a mitigating factor, I would love to know this. Maybe that can affect the outcome in the rest of your life.
When Browning said that there's no mitigating factor, it's like the police are working harder than him to help him. There's got to be some other reason, and Browning's just like, nope, there's no other reason. Psychopathic parasite offenders are extremely rare. Most of the parasite offenders overwhelmingly tend to be the ones that are severely abused. But that's not what we're seeing with Browning. He's manipulative, he's deceitful, he's a pathological liar. He essentially just, does not respect authority. He's not giving anything other than what he needs to give them.
I want to go to court. I'm going to get on my knees and cry. I look younger with his hair.
I just think if I have to be in here, God, I hate justice.
The phone call that we're hearing from Browning is almost a completely different person, and I think that's on purpose. The phone call, I think, is the Browning that friends would know. He did this because he wanted to do this. He did this because his level of psychopathy was such that he was going to be violent. He was going to be the violent psychopath.
The last time I was laying in the bed, I looked up at it, and it was just standing over me. That's demons and all that.
Who had the knife at that point?
It was just diving in that damn thing that is gray and that got red eyes.
The night doesn't begin with a scream. It begins with silence, the kind that presses against your ears and makes every small sound feel like a mistake. The kind of silence that settles over a neighborhood when the lights are out and the windows are closed and everyone assumes tomorrow will arrive exactly as planned. Because in the early hours of March 17, 1995, nothing looked broken yet. Nothing hinted that a story would begin here and refuse to end for decades. Nothing suggested that a single unlocked door on a quiet street in Northern California would become the hinge on which an entire community would turn and never quite turn back. The house sat at the end of the block, beige siding, low roof, a narrow driveway where a blue sedan cooled under a thin skin of fog. The kind of house you forget the moment you pass it. The kind of place where crimes are not supposed to happen, where headlines don't visit, where the worst thing anyone expected was a barking dog or a car alarm triggered by the wind. Inside, the television was still on, volume low, flickering light washing over the living room walls. And on the kitchen counter a cup of coffee had gone untouched long enough to grow cold. A thin skin forming on top like time itself had paused and waited. When the call came in just after 6 a.m., it was logged as a welfare check, routine, unremarkable, the kind of thing patrol officers handle without thinking twice, because the woman next door hadn't seen her neighbor that morning, and the newspaper was still on the porch, and the porch light was still on even though the sun had already begun to climb. The officers knocked. They waited. They tried again. The door opened with a soft creak, not forced, not damaged, just open enough to let the smell drift out, metallic and wrong. And in that moment the case was born, not with a name or a theory or a suspect, but with a feeling, a cold weight in the chest that told everyone present that this would not be easy, that this would not be quick, that whatever had happened here had already learned how to hide. Her name was Emily Carter, 29 years old, a graphic designer, recently promoted, recently single, recently moved into the neighborhood. The kind of person described later in interviews as quiet but friendly, private but warm, the kind of descriptions people reach for when they are trying to understand how someone so ordinary could vanish from the future so completely. She was found in the bedroom, no sign of forced entry, no sign of a struggle that made sense, no weapon left behind, just a scene that looked staged by someone who understood how police think, or someone who had more time than anyone would ever admit. By noon the street was sealed off. Yellow tape fluttered against mailboxes. Neighbors stood in clusters, arms crossed, voices low, trading fragments of rumor that hadn't yet learned the shape of truth. Reporters arrived before the sun had reached its peak. Cameras pointed at the house, then at the officers, then at the neighbors, hungry for words like mysterious and shocking, and quiet community rocked. Because this was exactly the kind of story that travels fast, the kind that turns a place into a before and an after. By nightfall, the phrase cold case hadn't been spoken yet, but it was already forming, invisible, waiting for time to give it weight. Detectives moved through the house slowly, methodically, photographing everything, touching almost nothing, because in 1995 the promise of DNA was still fragile, still new enough to inspire hope and doubt in equal measure. There were fibers on the carpet that didn't belong. A partial print on the bedroom door frame, smudged, incomplete. A maybe. A strand of hair caught in the bedsheet, dark, longer than Emily's, sent to a lab that would take weeks, then months, then years to say what it could and could not say. No signs of robbery. Her purse was still there. Her jewelry untouched. Her car parked outside. Whatever had happened, it wasn't random. And that realization settled over the investigation like a shadow that refused to move. They started where they always start. Friends. Co-workers. The ex-boyfriend whose name appeared again and again in early notes, circled, underlined, questioned until the questions lost their edge. He had an alibi. So did the co-worker who had argued with her 2 days earlier. So did the neighbor who had seen a man walking down the street around midnight but couldn't describe his face, only his height, only the way he walked, only the feeling that something about him didn't belong. Tips came in fast at first, then slowed, then thinned to a trickle of calls that went nowhere, each one carrying the same quiet disappointment. Weeks turned into months. The media moved on. The tape came down. The house was cleaned, then sold, then lived in again by people who tried not to think about what had happened in the bedroom down the hall. Inside the police department, the file grew heavier, thicker, filled with reports and photos and lab results that said almost enough but never quite enough. The hair couldn't be matched. The print didn't fit anyone in the system. The fibers suggested contact but not identity. Every lead ended the same way, with a dead end and a note written in the margin that said pending, or unlikely, or no further action. By the late 90s, the case had a label. Cold case. The words carried a strange comfort and a quiet accusation, a way of admitting defeat without saying the word out loud. The box was moved to a different shelf. The detectives who had worked it hardest were promoted, transferred, retired. Emily's name appeared less often in meetings, then almost never, except on anniversaries, except when a new investigator flipped through old files and felt that familiar pull, the sense that something had been missed, something small and sharp hiding between the lines. Her family never stopped asking questions. They wrote letters. They called. They sat across from detectives who promised to keep looking even when there was nothing left to look at. Each year the technology changed a little. Each year the hope flared and dimmed. DNA databases grew. Techniques improved. Evidence was retested, then tested again. In 2005, then again in 2012, the hair was pulled from storage and run through machines that didn't exist when it was first collected. Each time the answer came back the same way. No match. Not yet. Meanwhile, the neighborhood carried the story like a scar. Parents locked doors sooner. Strangers were watched more closely. Every unfamiliar car slowed the heart for just a second longer than necessary. The house at the end of the block changed color, changed owners, but never quite lost its reputation. People spoke about it in lowered voices, as if the walls themselves were listening, as if the case was not finished with them, as if it might wake up at any moment and demand attention again. Then years later, quietly without a press conference or a camera crew, something shifted. A technician reran a sample using a method that hadn't existed when the evidence was first sealed, a method that looked deeper, wider, that didn't need a perfect strand or a clean print to speak. The computer paused longer than usual. A name appeared, not as a suspect, not yet, just as a possibility, a distant echo in a database that had grown large enough to remember people the way the past never could. The result was flagged. Then flagged again. Then handed to a detective who had not been there in 1995, who had no memory of the house, no memory of the street, only a file and a sense that he was standing at the edge of something that could either collapse under scrutiny or finally come into focus. Word spread inside the department before it reached the outside world. Whispers of a DNA breakthrough. Emails marked confidential. Meetings behind closed doors. The phrase cold case solved hovered just out of reach, tempting, dangerous, powerful enough to rewrite history if it proved true. Devastating if it didn't. Because the name that surfaced belonged to someone who had lived nearby in the 90s, someone who had moved away, someone who had never been questioned, someone whose life had unfolded normally while Emily Carter's had stopped in a single room on a single night. As investigators began to retrace old steps with new eyes, the past resisted. Records were incomplete. Memories had softened. Witnesses disagreed with their younger selves. The street looked smaller now. The house looked different. But the questions felt the same, sharp and insistent, cutting through the years as if time had only made them angrier. How did someone enter without force? Why nothing was taken? How a life could end so quietly and leave behind so little certainty? By the time the first reporter called asking about movement in the case, the weight of expectation was already pressing down, heavy and dangerous, because after so many years, Solving a cold case isn't just about finding the truth, it's about surviving it. About proving that the answers you uncover can withstand the noise they will inevitably create. Somewhere between the lab and the file room, between the past and the present, the story began to breathe again, and the silence that had opened this case all those years ago started to fracture, not with a scream, but with a question that refused to stay buried any longer, a question that would soon spill beyond the walls of the department and back onto the street where it all began, asking whether this time, finally, the truth had decided to step into the light, or whether the cold case was only pretending to be solved. The name on the screen didn't shout. It didn't glow. It sat there in plain text, ordinary letters carrying an extraordinary weight, and the detective stared at it longer than necessary because names have a way of changing shape when you look at them through time, because a name that meant nothing in 1995 could now mean everything, and the room felt smaller the longer he stayed silent. The database had done what it was designed to do, reaching backward through decades, threading together fragments that once refused to speak, and now the question was no longer whether the case could move, but whether it should, because every cold case that wakes up carries the risk of waking up something else with it. The man's name was Daniel Reeves, 48 years old now, formerly 26 in 1995. No criminal record at the time. A short list of traffic violations, a missed court date. Nothing that would have placed him anywhere near the top of an old suspect board. Back then he lived 3 streets over, close enough to walk, close enough to blend, close enough to know the rhythm of the neighborhood without being known by it. He moved out of state in 1998. Married. 2 children. A job in logistics. A life that appeared, on paper, clean and unremarkable, the kind of life that makes investigators hesitate, because the past and the present rarely line up the way you expect them to. The hair from the bedsheet didn't match him directly. That would have been too easy. Instead, it matched a relative, a partial hit, a genetic echo that pointed in his direction without naming him outright. Familial DNA. A technique that turns families into maps and ancestry into evidence. Powerful. Controversial. Accurate enough to open doors that had been locked for years. The lab report didn't accuse. It suggested. It leaned forward and whispered, "Look here." They did what they always do when the past resurfaces. They went back to the beginning. Old reports were reread with new emphasis. Timelines were rebuilt. Addresses cross-checked. Daniel Reeves' name appeared exactly once in the original file, buried in a list of residents canvassed and cleared. No follow-up, no notes beyond a checkmark and a date. March 18, 1995. The day after Emily Carter was found. He had been home, he said. Asleep. Alone. No one contradicted him. No one could. The detective traced the streets on a map, finger moving slowly, counting steps the way someone might count years, imagining the distance between Daniel's apartment and Emily's house at 2 in the morning, imagining how long it would take to walk it without being seen, imagining how many times someone could pass by that house before learning which lights stayed on late, which windows were left unlocked, which routines never changed. Patterns are invisible until they're not. They requested old utility records, phone logs, employment schedules, anything that could anchor Daniel Reeves to a specific place at a specific time in 1995. Some records were gone, purged, destroyed according to policy. Others survived by accident. A handwritten time-off request from March 17, approved weeks earlier. No reason given. Just a single day circled on a page that had been yellowing in storage for decades. The coincidence was sharp enough to cut. When they spoke to his former neighbors, the answers came slowly, reluctantly, filtered through years of distance and selective memory. Yes, Daniel had lived there. Yes, he kept to himself. Yes, he sometimes walked late at night. No, no one remembered seeing him that particular evening. No, no one remembered anything strange. Memory, like evidence, degrades over time, and what's left is often shaped by what people want to believe. Inside the department, the tone shifted. Conversations lowered. Doors closed more often. The phrase California 1995 cold case solved appeared in internal emails, tentative, careful, followed by question marks and caveats. No one wanted to be wrong. No one wanted to resurrect a case only to bury it again under doubt. Because DNA can point, but it can't tell a story on its own. It can't explain motive. It can't describe a moment. It can't say why Emily Carter's life ended in that room while everything else remained untouched. They flew out to interview Daniel Reeves on a gray morning that matched the mood perfectly. He agreed to talk. He always agreed. In the interview room, he looked smaller than his file photo, older than his years, hands folded, posture careful, the posture of someone who had learned how to appear cooperative without revealing anything more than necessary. He denied knowing Emily, denied ever being inside her house, denied remembering that night at all. It was a long time ago, he said. People forget things. When they asked about the day off, he shrugged. Maybe he was sick. Maybe he had errands. He couldn't say. The detective watched his eyes, his hands, the way his foot tapped once and then stopped when he noticed it. There was nothing explosive, nothing cinematic, just a quiet resistance. A sense that every answer had been rehearsed not for this moment, but for a lifetime of moments like it. They took a fresh DNA sample. He didn't object. The swab was quick, clinical, unemotional. The waiting afterward was anything but. Back in California, the lab compared old evidence with new material using methods refined by years of failure and success in other cases. The partial print on the doorframe was scanned again, enhanced again, matched against databases that had grown fat with data. This time it didn't come back empty. Came back close. Close enough to reopen wounds that had barely scarred over. News leaked the way it always does, not in facts but in fragments. A reporter heard about a DNA hit. A producer heard about a suspect questioned out of state. The headline drafts began to circulate before the truth was ready. Words like breakthrough and solved, hovering dangerously close to the edge of certainty. Emily's family was notified before anything went public. They sat in a room with detectives who spoke carefully, deliberately, explaining possibilities instead of promises, progress instead of conclusions. Hope returned, but it arrived carrying fear with it, because hope after decades is heavy, and it demands answers it might not receive. The defense attorneys noticed too. They always do. Questions about evidence handling in 1995 surfaced. Chain of custody. Storage conditions. The integrity of samples that had been moved, tested, retested. The hair. The fibers. The print. Every piece of evidence became a potential liability. Every advancement in technology a double-edged blade. What science reveals, it also challenges. As investigators prepared to move forward, to build a case that could survive a courtroom instead of just a headline, the gaps in the story grew louder. There was no eyewitness placing Daniel Reeves at the house. No confession. No weapon. No explanation for why Emily would have let him in if she did. The unlocked door could mean familiarity. Or it could mean carelessness. The lack of forced entry could mean trust. Or it could mean timing. Late at night, the detective reread Emily's old emails, preserved on a dusty server, scanning for any hint of a connection, any overlap, any digital footprint that could bridge two lives that now seemed linked by nothing more than molecules and coincidence. There were messages about work, about friends, about plans that never happened, nothing about Daniel Reeves, nothing that made sense. And yet, the evidence insisted. The DNA didn't lie easily. The print didn't appear by accident. The odds narrowed, tightened, pointing again and again toward the same name. The same address. The same quiet man who said he couldn't remember a night that had defined everyone else's memory of 1995. The pressure mounted. From above. From outside. From within. Solve it. Prove it. Or let it go. As the case edged closer to a public reckoning, the community began to stir. Old fears resurfacing alongside new arguments. Was justice still possible after all this time? Was it right? Was it enough? The house at the end of the block appeared on the news again, its image flickering across screens just as it had decades earlier, a symbol of something unfinished. In the quiet moments between lab reports and legal meetings, one question refused to leave the room, hanging in the air like unfinished business, because if Daniel Reeves was responsible, he had lived a full life untouched by consequences, and if he wasn't, then the real answer was still out there, hidden, patient, waiting for another mistake, another advancement, another chance to remind everyone that a cold case doesn't stay cold because it wants to, but because the truth knows exactly how long it can afford to wait. The decision to move forward wasn't announced, it was felt. A subtle shift in posture and tone, a tightening of language in emails, a careful alignment of facts that had once lived far apart, Because reopening a case like this is less about charging ahead and more about leaning into uncertainty until it gives way or pushes back hard enough to knock you down. The prosecutor wanted certainty. The detectives wanted coherence. The family wanted the truth, whatever shape it took. And the truth, as it often does, remained quiet. They reconstructed the final 48 hours of Emily Carter's life, with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Receipts were pulled from old bank archives. Surveillance tapes, long thought erased, were tracked down in private storage rooms and back offices where no one had bothered to throw them away. A grainy image emerged from a convenience store camera 2 blocks from Emily's house, time-stamped 11:47 p.m., the night before her body was found. A woman matching her height and build stood at the counter, buying a bottle of water, her face half obscured by the camera's angle. Behind her, just visible in the reflection of the freezer door, a man waited. Tall, dark jacket, indistinct features. The footage froze on that frame, enlarged, sharpened, debated. It proved nothing. It suggested everything. Cell phone records from 1995 were crude by modern standards, but they still told a story in broad strokes. Emily had made 2 calls that evening. One to her sister. One to a number that no longer existed, a landline disconnected years ago, registered once to an apartment complex near Daniel Reeves' old address. The call lasted under a minute. Long enough to say hello. Long enough to say come over. Or don't. No recording. No transcript. Just a line on a page that suddenly felt like a scream trapped in ink. When confronted with the phone record, Daniel Reeves frowned, leaned back, shook his head. He didn't recognize the number. Didn't remember calling her. Didn't remember receiving a call. He reminded them again how long it had been, how unreliable memory is, how dangerous it can be to draw conclusions from fragments. He spoke calmly, reasonably, like someone explaining weather patterns or traffic, not a night that had ended a life. The detectives watched him closely, not for guilt, but for humanity, for some flicker of recognition or discomfort that might betray an internal struggle. It never came. His voice stayed even, his breathing steady. He asked practical questions about the process, about timelines, about his rights. He never asked about Emily. Not once. Back in California, the lab results continued to arrive, each one tightening the circle. The new DNA sample did not conclusively match the hair. It matched enough to matter. The partial print aligned more cleanly now, its ridges and whorls lining up with Daniel Reeves in ways they couldn't have seen in 1995. Statistically significant. Legally complex. The kind of evidence that can sway a jury or collapse under cross-examination depending on who tells the story better. The prosecutor hesitated. Cold cases demand perfection because time gives the defense a weapon sharper than any knife. Doubt. Witnesses forget. Evidence ages. Procedures evolve. Every step taken in 1995 was now judged by 2020 standards, and the file bore the scars of a different era, handwritten notes, missing signatures, evidence bags sealed with tape that no longer met current protocols. None of it meant the evidence was wrong. It meant it was vulnerable. As word spread through the community, reactions split along familiar lines. Some people wanted resolution at any cost. They spoke Emily's name again, lit candles, shared old news clippings online, convinced that justice delayed was still justice. Others pushed back, uneasy with the idea of familial DNA, uncomfortable with the notion that someone's relative could implicate them decades later. The phrase wrongful conviction surfaced in comment sections and talk radio, standing shoulder to shoulder with finally solved. Emily's family lived inside that tension. Her mother aged visibly in photographs taken weeks apart. Her sister spoke to reporters with a careful restraint that suggested she had learned the price of saying too much too soon. They wanted to believe the case was breaking open. They were terrified of believing it. Hope had burned them before. The detectives dug deeper into Daniel Reeves' past. Not just the official record but the unofficial one. The stories that don't make it into files. Former coworkers described him as quiet, intense, sometimes withdrawn. An ex-girlfriend from the early 90s agreed to talk after weeks of hesitation. She described a man who struggled with rejection, who could become cold without warning, who once showed up unannounced at her apartment late at night and refused to leave until she spoke to him. It wasn't a crime. It wasn't proof. It was texture. And texture matters when you're trying to paint a picture that has been fading for 25 years. Still, nothing placed him definitively inside Emily's house. No one saw him enter. No one heard a fight. No neighbors reported unusual noises. The night swallowed sound the way it often does, leaving investigators with a scene that felt staged, deliberate, almost restrained. Emily had not been bound. There were no defensive wounds consistent with a prolonged struggle. The cause of death suggested surprise, proximity, control. Someone she didn't have time to run from. Someone close enough to act quickly. The theory took shape slowly, cautiously. Daniel Reeves knew Emily, perhaps casually, perhaps through the neighborhood, perhaps through a connection that never left a paper trail. He contacted her that night or responded to her call. She let him in. Something shifted. Something escalated. The lack of chaos suggested familiarity or confidence. But theories are not verdicts, and every assumption added weight to a structure that could still collapse. When the prosecution finally agreed to convene a grand jury, the announcement hit like a thunderclap. Cameras returned to the street. The house was filmed again from every angle, its windows reflecting the past back at anyone willing to look. Daniel Reeves' name was now public. His family retreated from view. His neighbors watched him with new eyes, searching his face for something they felt they should have noticed before. Inside the grand jury room, the case was stripped of emotion and rebuilt with evidence and law. The DNA expert explained probabilities and margins of error. The detective walked through the timeline, the maps, the records. Emily's sister testified, her voice steady as she described the last conversation she remembered having. The defense challenged everything. The age of the evidence. The reliability of memory. The ethics of familial DNA. The danger of confirmation bias in a reopened cold case. The jury listened. They asked questions. They deliberated. Outside, the wait stretched on, hours turning elastic under the weight of expectation. When the decision came back, it was narrow. An indictment. Enough to move forward. Enough to say there was probable cause. Not enough to say the truth had been found. Daniel Reeves was arrested quietly, without spectacle, handcuffed on his front porch while cameras stayed at a distance. He did not resist. He did not speak. The headline wrote itself before the ink was dry. California 1995 cold case solved. DNA breakthrough stuns investigators. The words traveled fast, faster than nuance ever could. But inside the investigation, the celebration was muted. Solved is a dangerous word. It suggests an ending. And nothing about this case felt finished. Too many questions still floated unanswered, circling like vultures above a scene that had already been picked over by time. Why Emily? Why that night? Why no witnesses? Why now? As Daniel Reeves sat in a holding cell, the evidence against him solidifying into a narrative that could soon be tested in court, another thought crept quietly into the minds of those who knew the file best. A thought they did not voice, because to voice it would be to invite chaos. If the DNA had led them here after all these years, what else had it overlooked? What if the truth was not a straight line but a web, and they had only just begun to touch its edges? Outside, the community exhaled, believing, at least for a moment, that the long nightmare was ending. Inside the case file, the pages kept turning, restless, as if aware that indictments are not answers, that headlines are not justice, and that some cold cases, no matter how loudly they are declared solved, still have the power to change everything once the lights come on and the story is forced to speak for itself. The courtroom air felt heavier than it should have, as if decades of waiting had condensed into something physical, something that pressed against the chest the moment you stepped inside. Because trials like this don't just ask whether a man is guilty, they ask whether time itself can be trusted, whether memory can survive decay, whether science can reach backward without rewriting the past in the process. Daniel Reeves sat at the defense table in a dark suit that didn't quite fit, his hands folded the same way they had been in the interview room, his face composed, almost neutral, as if neutrality were a shield he had been practicing for years without knowing why. The prosecution opened with certainty. Emily Carter's name filled the room, spoken clearly, deliberately, attached to dates, locations, evidence numbers. They painted the picture they had spent years assembling. A quiet woman, a quiet street, a quiet night interrupted by violence that left no witnesses and almost no trace. They spoke of the unlocked door, the absence of chaos, the forensic trail that had refused to disappear no matter how long it was ignored. They spoke of DNA not as a miracle, but as persistence, as the slow accumulation of truth until it could no longer be denied. The defense listened without interrupting, saving their energy for later, because they knew the strongest arguments were not about what happened in 1995, but about everything that happened after, about how evidence ages, how certainty erodes, how confidence can be manufactured by repetition. When their turn came, they didn't deny the tragedy. They questioned the story. They reminded the jury that science is not static, that methods change, that what is considered reliable today may be considered flawed tomorrow. They warned against the seduction of closure, against the human desire to finish a story, even when the ending doesn't fit. Witnesses took the stand one by one, each carrying a fragment of the past. The convenience store clerk, older now, voice hesitant, described a night he barely remembered until investigators reminded him he should. The forensic analyst explained familial DNA in careful language, probabilities and exclusions and margins that blurred together under the pressure of legal scrutiny. A former detective admitted procedures that would never pass inspection today, sealing evidence with tape that cracked over time, logging samples by hand in notebooks that could be lost or misread. None of it was malicious. All of it was vulnerable. Emily's sister testified again, this time with the defense watching closely, ready to pounce on any inconsistency. She spoke of her last phone call, of a voice that sounded normal, of nothing that hinted at danger. She cried once, briefly, then steadied herself, because grief becomes efficient after long enough, trimmed down to essentials. The jury watched her, searching for truth in the lines of her face, in the pauses between words, because when evidence feels abstract, emotion becomes a guide, even when it shouldn't. Daniel Reeves did not testify. He didn't have to. His attorneys advised against it, and he followed their advice the same way he followed every instruction, every protocol, every step designed to minimize risk. Instead, they called their own witnesses, a statistician who challenged the interpretation of the DNA match, a memory expert who explained how suggestion and repetition can create confidence where none existed, a neighbor from Daniel's old building who said she didn't recall anything unusual about him, any late-night walks, any behavior that would set him apart. Normalcy was the defense's quiet refrain. As the days passed, the case narrowed, shedding excess until only the core remained, DNA that pointed without fully accusing, a print that aligned without fully matching, a theory that made sense without ever becoming certain. The jury took notes. They exchanged glances. They asked for evidence to be displayed again, enlarged, clarified. Each request tightened the room, because every repetition risked either solidifying belief or unraveling it. Outside, the media coverage intensified. Headlines hardened. Words like finally and at last appeared with increasing frequency, as if the verdict had already been reached. Commentators debated the ethics of familial DNA, the dangers of cold case prosecutions, the balance between justice and accuracy. Emily's face appeared on screens again, younger than she ever got to be, her image frozen in time while everyone else aged around it. Then, just as the trial seemed to settle into a predictable rhythm, the defense introduced something unexpected. An alternate timeline. A receipt from a gas station nearly 30 miles away, timestamp 12:13 a.m., the night of the murder bearing Daniel Reeves' name, linked to a loyalty card he had used sporadically in the 90s. The prosecution objected immediately, questioning the chain of custody, the relevance, the certainty that Daniel himself had been the one to make the purchase. The judge allowed it in. The room shifted. The receipt didn't prove innocence. It suggested possibility. If authentic, if accurate, it placed Daniel too far away at a critical moment. The prosecution countered with estimates of time of death, margins wide enough to swallow doubt, experts who testified that the window could stretch, compress, accommodate travel. The defense leaned into the uncertainty, arguing that the state could not ask a jury to fill gaps with assumptions, especially when a man's life was at stake. Behind the scenes, the investigators felt the ground move beneath them. The receipt had been overlooked in earlier reviews, dismissed as irrelevant because it didn't fit the emerging narrative. Now it demanded attention. They scrambled to verify it, to trace its origin, to determine whether it had been misfiled or misunderstood. The deeper they dug, the messier it became. Records from the gas station were incomplete. Surveillance footage was long gone. Employees couldn't remember who worked that shift. The receipt existed in a limbo that mirrored the case itself. When closing arguments arrived, they felt less like conclusions and more like competing realities. The prosecution spoke of patience, of science catching up to crime, of a man who had evaded accountability for decades finally being called to answer. The defense spoke of doubt, of the danger of mistaking advancement for accuracy, of a system so eager to solve a cold case that it risked freezing the wrong man in place. The jury deliberated for 3 days. 3 days of silence punctuated by requests for transcripts, for exhibits, for clarification. Emily's family waited together, hands clasped, faces drawn tight by a hope they no longer trusted. Daniel Reeves waited alone, staring at nothing, his expression unchanged, as if preparing for any outcome by refusing to imagine either. When the verdict came, it didn't explode. It landed quietly. Not guilty. The words rippled through the room, soft but devastating. Because acquittals in cases like this don't feel like endings. They feel like doors closing on rooms no one is ready to leave. Emily's sister cried openly this time. The prosecution stared at their notes as if something might rearrange itself if they looked long enough. Daniel Reeves exhaled, a sound almost imperceptible, then stood, free in the legal sense, unchanged in the public one. The headlines shifted, confusion replacing certainty. Cold case verdict shocks courtroom. DNA evidence questioned. Justice denied or doubt preserved. The community fractured again, old wounds reopened, arguments reignited. Some believed the jury had done the right thing, protecting against a dangerous precedent. Others believed justice had slipped away a second time, stolen not by a killer, but by time itself. The case file returned to its shelf, heavier now, marked not just by age but by failure, by the knowledge that the most promising lead had ended in acquittal. Officially, the case was unsolved again. Unofficially, it was something worse. A story with a suspect cleared by law but not by public opinion. A truth that refused to settle into any single shape. Daniel Reeves moved away once more. His life permanently altered by an accusation that would follow him everywhere. Even without a conviction, Emily Carter remained where she had always been, in memory, in photographs, in a room that no longer existed the way it once had. The DNA evidence was returned to storage, its potential both proven and limited. A reminder that science can open doors but cannot force answers to walk through them. And somewhere in the quiet aftermath, after the cameras left and the courtroom emptied, the question that had haunted this case from the beginning returned, sharper than ever, because if Daniel Reeves was not the one, then the trail that had finally warmed after decades had gone cold again, and the truth, whatever it was, had slipped back into the dark, carrying with it the unsettling possibility that it might never come back, that some cold cases don't end with justice or closure, but with a verdict that leaves everyone standing in the same place they started, staring at the past, knowing it still has something to hide. After the verdict, silence returned in pieces, uneven and sharp, settling over the case like dust that refused to lie flat, because acquittal does not erase suspicion, and it does not answer questions, it only changes who is allowed to ask them out loud. The file was officially closed again, stamped, logged, returned to climate-controlled darkness, but the people who had lived inside it knew better. Cases like this don't end. They hibernate. The first crack appeared less than a week later, not in a lab or a courtroom, but in a voicemail left on a detective's phone just after midnight, a voice rough with age and hesitation, a voice that said, "I didn't think it mattered anymore, but now I'm not so sure." A voice that carried the weight of someone who had spent decades convincing themselves that silence was the same thing as innocence. The caller didn't leave a name. Only a street. Only a year. 1995. They followed it quietly, without reopening anything on paper, because unofficial inquiries are sometimes the only way forward when the official ones have failed too publicly to survive another misstep. The street was 2 blocks from Emily Carter's house, a narrow lane lined with trees that had grown taller since the 90s, their roots lifting sidewalks in places where children once rode bikes. The house number belonged to a man named Richard Hale, 73 years old, retired electrician, lived alone now. In 1995, he had lived there with his wife, who had died 10 years earlier. First, he didn't want to talk. He stood in the doorway, hands gripping the frame, eyes darting past the detectives as if someone might be listening. When he finally spoke, it came in fragments, disjointed, like a memory that had been folded too many times. He said that on the night Emily died, he had been awake late, unable to sleep, watching television with the volume low. He said he saw a man walking down the street just after midnight, not Daniel Reeves, not anyone he recognized, but someone moving with purpose, fast but not running. He said the man stopped briefly near Emily's house, then disappeared into the shadows between the buildings. Why hadn't he said this before? Richard's answer was simple and devastating. No one had asked him. Or maybe they had, and he had said he didn't remember because at the time it felt like nothing, and later it felt too late, and eventually it felt dangerous to change your story when everyone else seemed so certain. Memory calcifies around fear. The description was vague. Medium build. Dark clothing. No clear facial features. It was by itself useless. But it reopened something investigators had tried not to touch since the acquittal. The possibility that the DNA had pointed them close to the truth without landing on it. That familial matches can illuminate branches without revealing the root. They revisited the partial print on the door frame, not to rematch it, but to recontextualize it. In 1995, the assumption had been that it belonged to the person who entered the room last. But prints don't come with timestamps. The door frame could have been touched days earlier, weeks, by anyone. The certainty they had built around it began to thin. Then there was the hair. The infamous strand that had driven the case forward, and then nearly broken it in court. It matched a relative of Daniel Reeves, not Daniel himself. The prosecution had leaned into proximity, into probability. But probability is not identity, and identity matters when the margin for error includes an entire human life. Investigators pulled genealogical charts again, expanding outward instead of inward this time, tracing the DNA line not toward Daniel, but away from him. Brothers, cousins, second cousins, names that had never appeared in the file. One of them stood out. Mark Reeves, Daniel's older cousin. In 1995, Mark was 32, unemployed, drifting between jobs and couches, a man whose record included assault charges that never stuck and a restraining order filed by a former partner and later dropped. He lived in the same general area at the time. He moved frequently. He was never interviewed. He had never shown up in any database because his DNA had never been collected. They checked his whereabouts now. Prison. Serving time for an unrelated violent offense committed in the early 2000s. A conviction that had come too late to help Emily Carter, and too early to be ignored. The detectives exchanged a look they had learned to recognize. Not excitement. Not triumph. The look that says this could change everything or it could destroy what little clarity we have left. They requested access to Mark Reeves under the guise of a routine interview, careful not to trigger alarms that might shut the door before they even reached it. He agreed to talk. In the visiting room, he smiled too easily, leaned back too comfortably, as if he enjoyed the attention. He denied knowing Emily Carter, denied being near her house, denied everything with a confidence that felt practiced, rehearsed, worn smooth by repetition. But when they asked about Daniel, something shifted. The smile faltered, just for a second, long enough to notice. He said they weren't close, hadn't been close, but the records told a different story. Phone calls between them in early 1995. Not many, but enough. Enough to suggest contact around the time Emily died. They took Mark's DNA. This time there was resistance, complaints, legal threats. It took weeks to get the warrant approved. Weeks of waiting while the case hung suspended again. Balanced between revelation and disappointment. When the results came back, they were definitive in a way the earlier ones had never been. The hair from the bedsheet matched Mark Reeves. Not partially. Not probabilistically. Directly. The room went quiet. Not with celebration. With dread. Because proving a match is one thing. Proving guilt is another. Mark Reeves was already incarcerated. His movements in 1995 would have to be reconstructed from scraps. His credibility was non-existent. His word useless. And Daniel Reeves, the man the world had already decided was the killer, had been acquitted. The narrative had hardened around him. Changing it now would mean admitting a catastrophic misdirection. A public error built on science that had promised clarity and delivered chaos. They went back to Richard Hale's statement, to the shadowy figure on the street. They overlaid timelines. Mark Reeves had no alibi that night. None that could be verified. They found a former acquaintance who remembered Mark sleeping on a couch nearby during that period. A woman who said he would leave late at night and return agitated, pacing, drinking, once mentioning a situation that had gotten out of hand. She hadn't known what it meant. She hadn't wanted to know. The prosecutor's office was divided. Reopening the case again would invite scrutiny they might not survive. The defense community would circle instantly, pointing to the acquittal, to double jeopardy confusion in the public mind, to the fragility of cold case prosecutions. Emily's family would be dragged back into the storm, asked to hope again after learning how dangerous hope can be. And yet, the DNA was undeniable. Stronger than anything they had presented at trial. Strong enough to rewrite the story from the beginning. Not solved. Misunderstood. Not justice delayed. Justice derailed. Before any announcement could be made, before any charges could be filed, Mark Reeves attacked another inmate. Brutally. He was placed in solitary confinement, cut off from contact, unreachable. The timing felt cruel, almost deliberate, as if the truth itself had flinched. When detectives finally reached him again weeks later, he refused to speak. Lawyered up. Silent. The news leaked anyway. It always does. A blog post first. Then a local station. Then national outlets, scrambling to untangle a narrative that had already been sold as complete. New DNA raises questions. Wrong man accused. Cold case chaos. Daniel Reeves issued a statement through his attorney, declaring vindication, demanding apologies. None came. Emily Carter's family said nothing publicly, retreating into a grief that now had too many faces to count. Inside the department, the case was no longer just a murder. It was a warning. About overconfidence. About the seduction of breakthroughs. About how easily science can be turned into a story before it has finished speaking. And still, the most dangerous question remained unanswered, hanging in the air like a charge that refused to dissipate, because if Mark Reeves was the source of the DNA, if he was the man on the street, if he was the one who entered that house, then how much of what they thought they knew was wrong, and how many years had the truth been waiting, not to be discovered, but to be believed, in a system that had already decided it was done listening. The second reopening never made it onto a press release. It lived in late-night meetings, in whispered phone calls, in documents marked draft and never finalized, because by the time Mark Reeves' DNA came back as a direct match, the system was already exhausted, bruised by its own certainty, wary of admitting how fragile the first conclusion had been. The truth had arrived late, carrying complications instead of clarity, and no one knew how to let it in without tearing something else apart. Mark Reeves sat in solitary, a concrete room with no windows and no audience, and the silence around him felt intentional, protective, as if the case itself were trying to decide whether he deserved to speak. His attorney refused interviews. Motions were filed preemptively, challenging evidence that hadn't yet been presented, attacking chain of custody, contamination risks, laboratory bias, anything that could slow momentum long enough for doubt to take root again. The playbook was familiar. The stakes were higher. Detectives rebuilt the timeline one more time, this time without Daniel Reeves anywhere near it, erasing weeks of work, months of certainty, years of assumption. Mark's movements in 1995 were harder to trace. He didn't keep steady jobs. He didn't own a car consistently. He stayed where he could. People like that leave fewer footprints, and the footprints they do leave are easy to ignore until it's too late. One address kept resurfacing. A duplex less than a mile from Emily Carter's house, occupied briefly by Mark in early 1995, sublet from a friend who had since disappeared into a different life. The proximity mattered. Walking distance. Familiar streets. Familiar rhythms. The kind of closeness that makes opportunity feel inevitable instead of planned. They found another witness. Or maybe they found someone who had finally decided to stop hiding behind not remembering. A woman who had lived across from the duplex in 1995, now in her 60s, hands shaking as she described a man who used to sit on the front steps late at night, watching cars go by, smoking, staring too long at people who didn't notice him. She remembered seeing him argue with a woman once, his voice low but sharp, the woman backing away toward the sidewalk. She couldn't say it was Emily. She couldn't say it wasn't. Memory is a language that loses vocabulary over time. The physical evidence began to realign around Mark Reeves in subtle but disturbing ways. The fibers on Emily's carpet, once dismissed as generic, matched the material of a jacket Mark was known to wear in the 90s, a cheap brand widely sold, but the color, the weave, the wear pattern aligned more closely than anyone liked to admit. The prosecution hesitated again. Pattern evidence persuades. It rarely proves. They revisited Emily's habits. Her routines. She often walked in the evenings. She spoke to neighbors casually. She didn't advertise fear. Mark Reeves could have seen her before that night. Once. Twice. Enough to create a sense of familiarity that didn't exist. Enough to knock on a door without setting off alarms. Then came the detail no one had emphasized before because it hadn't fit either narrative. The coffee cup on the counter. Untouched. Skin forming on top. Suggesting an interruption. Suggesting expectation. Emily had been waiting for someone. Or had just welcomed someone inside. The assumption had always been that she knew the person who came through that door. But knowing doesn't have to mean trusting. Sometimes it just means recognizing. Mark Reeves refused to answer questions about Emily. But he made one mistake. In a recorded call from prison, speaking to a relative who didn't know it would be reviewed, he said, "They're digging up old ghosts again. Stuff that should have stayed buried." He didn't name Emily. He didn't need to. Context did the work for him. The district attorney faced a decision that would define careers. File charges against Mark Reeves and risk public backlash, accusations of incompetence, lawsuits from Daniel Reeves for wrongful prosecution. Or quietly let the evidence sit, labeled inconclusive, allowing the case to remain officially unsolved but unofficially understood by those closest to it. Justice versus survival. Truth versus institution. The gap between them felt impossibly wide. Emily's family was informed privately. No cameras. No premises. Just facts delivered carefully, gently, as if facts themselves could bruise. They listened without interrupting. When it was over, Emily's sister asked one question. Why now? No one answered because the real answer was unbearable. Because the system wasn't ready before. Because technology wasn't ready. Because people weren't listening to the right things. Word reached Daniel Reeves that the case had shifted again. He reacted with anger, not relief. Anger that his name had already been welded to a crime he didn't commit in the public imagination. Anger that a different Reeves might have been responsible all along. Anger that no verdict could give him back the life he had lost. His lawsuit moved forward quietly. Another layer of consequence settling onto a case already buckling under its own weight. Mark Reeves' prison behavior deteriorated. He became volatile. Fights. Infractions. Isolation. Some saw guilt in it. Others saw desperation. Either way, his silence grew heavier, more intentional. Confession, if it came, would not come easily. People like Mark don't confess out of conscience. They confess out of leverage. The detectives knew time was their enemy again. Mark Reeves was aging. Witnesses were aging faster. Evidence had already survived longer than anyone expected. If they were going to act, it had to be soon. They began drafting a case built not just on DNA but on convergence, opportunity, proximity, behavior. The kind of case that relies on accumulation instead of certainty. But accumulation invites attack. The defense would dismantle it piece by piece. The public would ask how the system could be wrong twice. How DNA could point one way and then another. How justice could be trusted at all. Late one night, alone in the evidence room, a detective stood in front of the box labeled Carter, Emily, and felt something close to resignation. Not defeat. Something colder. The understanding that even if Mark Reeves were charged, even if he were convicted, even if the story finally aligned, it would never feel clean. Never feel solved. Because too much time had passed. Too many lives had been bent around the wrong shape of truth. Outside, the neighborhood slept again, unaware that the past was still moving beneath it, restless, unfinished, because the most dangerous thing about a cold case isn't that it stays cold. It's that when it finally warms, it can burn everything it touches, leaving behind not closure, but scars that prove how long the truth was willing to wait before it demanded to be seen. The charge came quietly, almost apologetically, buried beneath legal language and procedural caution, Because by the time the state moved against Mark Reeves, no one believed in grand announcements anymore. No press conference. No victory statements. Just a filing a date. A name that had finally settled into the center of the page after decades of orbiting its edges. Murder. Special circumstances declined. The system had learned humility the hard way. Mark Reeves was transferred out of solitary for the first time in months, escorted into an interview room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old fear. He looked thinner. Older. His eyes moved constantly, scanning for angles, for exits, for advantage. He smiled when the detectives entered, the same easy smile from before, but it didn't land the way it once had. There was something brittle about it now, something stretched too thin. They didn't start with accusations. They started with time. They talked about 1995 like it was a place instead of a year, describing streets, weather, music on the radio, details that seem harmless until they begin to tighten around memory. Mark listened. Occasionally he nodded. He corrected small things. A street name. A distance. Each correction a thread, each thread something to pull. When they showed him the DNA report, he laughed. Not loudly. Not nervously. He laughed like someone who had been waiting for a particular punchline, and was relieved it had finally arrived. He said labs make mistakes. He said evidence gets contaminated. He said they were desperate. He said a lot of things. He did not say no. They shifted tactics. They showed him photos of Emily Carter. Not the crime scene. Not the autopsy. Just a portrait. Her smiling. Alive. Frozen in a moment that had no idea what was coming. His eyes lingered longer than necessary. A second too long. A detail that would never make it into a transcript, but would live forever in the minds of the people who saw it. He leaned forward then, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. He asked what they really wanted. Justice, they said. He smiled again. Justice is expensive, he replied. And suddenly the room understood him better than it wanted to. Mark Reeves didn't confess. He negotiated. He asked about sentencing. About conditions. About whether his existing conviction could be leveraged. He spoke in hypotheticals, never attaching himself directly to the act, but circling it, outlining it, testing the shape of it to see how it felt. He described a man who felt invisible. A man who watched people and felt owed something he couldn't name. A man who crossed a line one night and spent the rest of his life pretending it had never been there. The detectives let him talk. Silence, they knew, was the most dangerous thing in the room. Eventually, he said something he hadn't meant to. He mentioned the coffee. He mentioned that it had gone cold. No one had ever told him that detail. It had never been released publicly. The air changed instantly. He stopped speaking. Looked at the table. Looked back up. Too late. His attorney ended the interview shortly after. But the damage was done. The slip wasn't a confession. Didn't need to be. It was context. Knowledge. Presence. The kind of mistake that doesn't happen unless you were there. Unless the memory had been living somewhere inside you, waiting for the wrong moment to surface. The defense strategy pivoted immediately. They attacked the interview. Coercion. Leading questions. Psychological pressure. They argued that Mark Reeves was a known manipulator, that he absorbed details from years of media coverage, that nothing he said could be trusted. The prosecution countered with restraint, with documentation, with the simple fact that the coffee detail had never existed outside sealed files. Meanwhile, Daniel Reeves' lawsuit gained traction. Depositions were scheduled. Emails were subpoenaed. Internal doubts from the first investigation surfaced. Lines of hesitation buried under confidence. The department's mistakes were laid bare in language that felt clinical but cut deeply. The public began to understand that the story they had consumed so eagerly had been incomplete at best, wrong at worst. Emily Carter's family withdrew again. They stopped answering calls. Stopped reading articles. They had learned that proximity to the process only multiplied pain. Privately, they prepared themselves for another trial. Another cycle of hope and restraint. Another public examination of a loss that had never belonged to the public in the first place. As Mark Reeves awaited trial, new fragments emerged. A former cellmate came forward, claiming Mark had talked in his sleep, muttering about a woman who wouldn't stop looking at him like she knew. The testimony was weak, incentivized, dangerous to rely on. But it added to the weight, the sense of convergence that was becoming harder to dismiss. The neighborhood reacted differently this time. Less shock, less certainty, more fatigue. People had learned not to trust headlines, not to assume endings. The house at the end of the block was no longer filmed. It had aged into anonymity again. A quiet structure holding too many stories in its walls. Inside the prosecution team, the question was no longer whether Mark Reeves could be convicted. It was whether the conviction would mean anything after so much failure. Would it bring peace? Would it restore trust? Or would it simply confirm what everyone already suspected, that the system had stumbled toward the truth instead of walking to it, that justice here would always feel compromised? On the eve of trial, Mark Reeves requested another interview. No lawyers present, he insisted. Just to talk. The request was denied. The risk was too high. Whatever he wanted to say could wait for the courtroom, for the record, for the version of the truth that survives on paper. That night, alone in his cell, Mark Reeves wrote a letter. Not a confession. Not an apology. Just a series of sentences that circled the same idea over and over again. That some moments follow you no matter how far you walk away. That some doors once opened never really close. The letter was seized. Logged. Entered into evidence. As the trial approached, the weight of it pressed down on everyone connected to the case, because this time there would be no illusion of a clean ending, no triumphant declaration of a cold case solved. There would only be a verdict layered on top of another verdict, a truth laid over a mistake, and the quiet understanding that even if the jury got it right, the damage done by years of waiting and misdirection would never fully heal. And somewhere beneath the legal strategy and procedural caution, beneath the headlines being drafted more carefully now, the core of the story remained unchanged, because a woman had gone to bed one night expecting tomorrow, and tomorrow never came, and everything that followed, every trial, every test, every doubt, was just the long echo of that single interruption, still reverberating through time, refusing to fade, refusing to let anyone pretend that the past was finished speaking. The second trial opened without the illusion of novelty. No one pretended this was history being made. It felt more like history correcting itself, slowly, reluctantly, under fluorescent lights that flattened everything they touched. The courtroom was half full, not because interest had faded, but because belief had. People had learned to keep their distance from certainty. Mark Reeves entered in shackles, the metal sound sharp against the polished floor. A sound that drew eyes despite everyone's best effort not to stare. He looked out once, scanning faces, then sat, shoulders loose, posture almost casual, as if the weight of what was happening belonged to someone else. The judge reminded the room that this was a new case, a new defendant, a new burden of proof. The words landed, but they didn't erase the ghosts already sitting in the jury box. The prosecution opened carefully. No declarations. No promises. They framed the case as convergence, not revelation. DNA that now spoke clearly. Opportunity shaped by proximity. Behavior that aligned too neatly to ignore. They acknowledged the past openly, the misstep, the acquittal, the damage done by premature certainty, and in doing so, they tried to earn something more valuable than agreement. They tried to earn trust. The defense attacked immediately. They didn't deny the DNA. They questioned everything around it. Storage conditions. Testing protocols. The timing of discovery. They suggested contamination not as a theory, but as a mood, something that could have seeped into evidence unnoticed after years of handling. They reminded the jury that this same system had pointed the finger before and been wrong. If it could be wrong once, it could be wrong again. The DNA analyst took the stand, older than the science he described, methodical, precise, careful to say only what could be defended. This was not familial matching. This was direct. The hair recovered from the bedsheet matched Mark Reeves to a degree that made coincidence mathematically implausible. The defense pressed. Could someone else have transferred it? Could it have been secondary contact? The analyst answered without drama. Possible. Unlikely. The difference mattered. Then came the coffee. The detail that had slipped. The cup. The skin on top. The interruption frozen in time. The detective described the interview where Mark mentioned it unprompted. The defense objected. The judge allowed it. The jury leaned forward. Knowledge is a quiet kind of evidence, but it carries weight when it appears where it shouldn't. Witnesses followed. The woman from across the duplex spoke softly, hands folded, eyes unfocused as if she were watching something only she could see. She described the man on the steps. The way he watched. The way he seemed to exist just outside of things. The defense dismantled her memory piece by piece, years eroding accuracy, suggestion shaping recollection. She didn't argue. She simply said she knew what she saw then, even if she couldn't prove it now. The former acquaintance testified about Mark's late-night disappearances, his agitation, his drinking, the comment about a situation that had gotten out of hand. The defense suggested resentment, unreliability, motive to exaggerate. The prosecution didn't resist too hard. They let the testimony stand as texture, not structure. When the recorded prison call was played, the courtroom went still. Mark's voice filled the room, casual, irritated, speaking about old ghosts being dug up, about things that should have stayed buried. The defense argued ambiguity. Everyone has ghosts. Everyone resents scrutiny. The prosecution didn't argue back. They didn't need to. The words had already done their work. Mark Reeves did not testify. His attorney said nothing about it. Some jurors noticed. Some didn't. Silence means different things to different people. Outside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt brittle. Reporters were restrained, burned by the last time they had trusted momentum. Articles used words like alleged and possible. The headline writers hesitated. The community watched from a distance, emotionally arm's length, unwilling to invest again. Daniel Reeves' lawsuit hovered over the proceedings like weather. Depositions continued in parallel. Emails revealed internal doubts, warnings raised and ignored. The moment when the narrative had outpaced the evidence. The department prepared statements they hoped they would never need to release. Accountability loomed, indifferent to outcomes. Emily Carter's family returned on the third day. They sat together, hands touching, faces composed into something practiced and durable. They watched the evidence pass in front of them like a procession of years they had already lived through in private. When the hair was displayed again, sealed, labeled final, Emily's sister closed her eyes. Not in grief. In exhaustion. The defense saved its strongest move for the end. They introduced a forensic consultant who challenged the assumption that the hair had been deposited during the crime. Environmental transfer. Prior contact. Innocent presence. They suggested Mark Reeves could have been in the house before, for reasons that didn't involve violence. The theory was thin. It didn't need to be thick. It needed to be possible.
Closing argument à voix d'aide spectacle.
The prosecution asked the jury to look at the whole, not the gaps. The defense asked them to protect against error, to remember that the last time a story felt complete, it wasn't. Both were right. That was the problem. Deliberations stretched into a second week. Questions came back. About DNA. About timelines. About reasonable doubt. The judge answered carefully. The jury returned to their room, the door closing softly behind them, sealing in a decision that would have consequences no matter which way it fell. When the verdict arrived, the courtroom filled quickly, drawn by the gravity of resolution, even if no one believed in clean endings anymore. Mark Reeves stood. The jury foreperson spoke. Guilty. The word landed without sound, absorbed by the room as if it had been waiting there all along. Emily's family didn't cry. They held each other. Daniel Reeves was not present. The prosecution exhaled, not in relief but in acceptance. The defense nodded once, already thinking ahead to appeals. Mark Reeves looked forward, expression unreadable, as if the moment had confirmed something he had always known would eventually catch up to him. Sentencing would come later. Appeals would follow. Lawsuits would continue. None of it felt like an ending. It felt like a hinge, a point where the past and present finally acknowledged each other without flinching. Outside, the street remained quiet. The house stood where it always had, changed and unchanged, a witness that would never testify. The headlines were cautious this time. Second trial brings conviction. Cold case turns again. The word solved appeared less often, as if everyone had learned how dangerous it could be. Because even with a verdict, even with DNA that finally spoke clearly, the case left behind a residue that would not wash away. Years lost. Lives altered. Trust fractured and slowly, imperfectly rebuilding. Justice had arrived, but it came carrying baggage, reminders that truth can be delayed, distorted, misheard, and still matter when it finally forces its way through. And in the quiet after the courtroom emptied, after the cameras shut down and the arguments dissolved into paperwork, the story settled into its final uneasy shape, not as a triumph, not as a failure, but as a warning written in human cost, that some cold cases don't wait to be solved, they wait to be understood, and by the time understanding arrives, it has already changed everyone who touched it. The aftermath of the verdict was not celebratory. There were no parades, no banners, no sense of triumph. Only quiet. Quiet in the department, quiet in the neighborhood, quiet in the lives of those who had been entwined with this case for decades. A case that had started as tragedy, had twisted into confusion, had warped into public spectacle, now existed as something almost clinical, catalogued into finality on paper but lingering everywhere else. Detectives walked the old streets again, not as investigators, but as witnesses to their own past assumptions. Sidewalk cracks had shifted over 20 years, paint had faded on the houses, the trees had grown taller, their roots intruding into everything, as if the neighborhood itself remembered more than the people in it. The lane where Emily Carter lived felt smaller, quieter, haunted not by Mark Reeves' presence but by absence, by everything that had slipped through the cracks of time, unnoticed until DNA forced it into the light. Emily's bedroom had been cleared years before, but the memories of it persisted. Investigators carried them in their minds. The neatly made bed, the personal touches that spoke of teenage routines, the items that suggested normality, which was shattered in a single night. They had studied every fiber, every print, every microscopic strand, and still the room refused to yield peace. The coffee cup, the bedsheet, the hairs, the shadow glimpsed by Richard Hale. All of it had been pieces of a story that didn't want to be neatly told. Mark Reeves was now serving consecutive sentences. The prison system absorbed him efficiently, turning him into a number again, a fact of routine. Yet, inside, the man was no less present in the minds of those who had chased him for decades. Detectives revisited their notes, looking at the slip in the prison call, the unprompted mention of the coffee cup, the way he circled around admissions without ever landing on them directly. Behavioral patterns that once felt elusive were now, in hindsight, stark and alarming. Daniel Reeves remained a public figure of caution. Wrongly accused, his reputation had been shaken, but acquittal had preserved his freedom. Lawsuits and legal maneuvers filled his days. He had survived the first storm of accusation only to live in the shadows of the second. For him, the term justice had become slippery, tied less to fact and more to endurance. The community, meanwhile, struggled with the aftershocks. 20 years of belief, certainty, and rumor had woven themselves into the neighborhood's consciousness. To many, the truth arriving now seemed anticlimactic. To others, it was a shockwave. How could DNA, decades old, overturn everything people had assumed? How could the facts have existed dormant all this time, like a dangerous secret waiting to be read correctly? Some former neighbors came forward quietly, telling stories that had been buried out of fear or indifference. A man who had mowed his lawn past Emily's house recalled a figure slipping between shadows, someone he had ignored then, someone whose movements now felt sinister in retrospect. A woman remembered hearing a scream late at night, not realizing it mattered until the details aligned with what the police eventually confirmed. These fragments of memory, decades old, pieced together an atmosphere of tension that had gone unnoticed, invisible to those who assumed the world was as it seemed. The press, more cautious than in the past, covered the story in measured tones. "Cold case solved," read one headline, but the subtext carried hesitation. Words like finally and decades later were everywhere, underscoring the long wait for resolution and the fractures left behind. Analysts and crime commentators debated aloud on live television. Could the system prevent misidentification? Could familial DNA be trusted? Could investigators rely on memory decades after the fact? These questions seemed to swirl endlessly, unanswered, because the case was now larger than the crime itself. Inside the police department, veterans of the original investigation reflected quietly. They had been wrong before. They had pursued a theory built on circumstantial DNA and the pressure of public expectation. That they had not recognized Mark Reeves sooner gnawed at them. They acknowledged procedural flaws, missteps, and the dangers of certainty. The lesson was bitter. Even science, when filtered through human bias, could mislead. Emily Carter's family lived in a space of private reckoning. Public statements were brief. Behind closed doors, they went through old photographs, letters, and mementos, confronting a timeline that had been rewritten multiple times. They had lived with ambiguity for over 20 years, alternating between hope, despair, and the exhaustion of unresolved grief. Now, with Mark Reeves convicted, closure existed only in fragments. There was no satisfaction, only the understanding that the truth had taken a path far longer and crueler than anyone could have imagined. And yet, the cold case had achieved what it promised in a limited sense. The guilty party was finally identified, the DNA conclusive, the facts aligned. But the shadow of the original misdirection, the years of accusation against Daniel Reeves, the long months of investigation, the lingering doubt in the public's mind, all of it remained. Justice had arrived, but it was not tidy. It did not erase the scars. It did not undo the past. At night, investigators walked the streets silently, thinking about Emily. Her bedroom no longer existed as a crime scene, her presence reduced to memory and evidence, yet it haunted them in subtle ways. The way a streetlight fell across a sidewalk, the way shadows lingered near a corner, the way ordinary neighborhoods still carried traces of extraordinary violation. Mark Reeves' conviction closed the case officially, but cold cases never truly close. They ripple through time. They haunt those who investigated, those who were accused, and those who loved the victim. The truth, delayed, can bring relief, but it also brings reckoning. How long justice can be deferred, how easily suspicion can mislead, and how many lives can be reshaped before the facts finally assert themselves. In the end, the story of Emily Carter was etched into the memory of the city. It became part of its quiet streets, its old houses, and its late-night murmurs, a reminder that even when a cold case is technically solved, its impact lingers, stretching into decades, coloring the lives of everyone it touched, leaving behind an afterimage of fear, sorrow, and the complex, inescapable pursuit of truth. By the 10th year after the arrest, Mark Reeves had become a fixture of the prison system, a name filed in spreadsheets and case notes, rarely thought of outside its official boundaries. But the reverberations of the 1995 crime remained active in the outside world, invisible yet persistent, like a pulse under the skin of the city. Detectives still remembered the little things, the fibers, the coffee cup, the unprompted mention in the prison call, as though they were the only details keeping the case alive, small lighthouses in a dark sea of uncertainty. Daniel Reeves, despite having been cleared, carried the case with him in a different way. Every interaction, every conversation about crime, justice, or misidentification became a reminder of the fragility of reputation. Lawyers and journalists sometimes approached him cautiously, aware of his past ordeal, unsure of how much he wanted to engage. He rarely gave answers beyond the minimum, his voice even neutral, a shield constructed over decades of frustration. Yet behind it, a simmering tension remained, the sense that life had already been stolen once, and could not be restored. Inside the police department, the cold case unit took on a reverent tone toward evidence storage. Each box, each envelope, each sealed bag was a testament to patience, a recognition that time could reveal what the first rush of certainty might obscure. Young officers were trained not just to collect, but to anticipate the future. How a fragment of DNA could sit dormant for decades, how a witness could return after 20 years, how memory itself could evolve and betray. Lessons were harsh, imprinted by mistakes that had been public, humiliating, and costly. Emily Carter's family, still private, returned occasionally to the small memorials that had been placed in her honor. A single flower on the steps, a candle flickering in a window, a note tucked into a mailbox. They no longer sought justice. They understood that the law had its limitations, but they maintained presence, small acts of memory that refused to let the neighborhood forget the human life behind the case files. Their grief had become a quiet, enduring vigilance, a subtle insistence that the world not move on too quickly, that Emily's story remain acknowledged. Mark Reeves, meanwhile, was a different kind of cautionary figure. Inside prison, he studied legal manuals, read procedural handbooks, and observed other inmates. He measured the consequences of every word, every gesture, every action. The man who had once moved invisibly through neighborhoods, whose habits had gone unnoticed, was now catalogued in every way possible. Yet his presence continued to linger in the minds of those who had investigated him. The quiet persistence of guilt, now solidified in law but unresolved in the imagination. The cold case team occasionally revisited Emily's neighborhood, not for evidence, but to keep the past tangible. Sidewalks were repaired, paint refreshed, new families moved in, and yet every officer who walked past that intersection felt the weight of history, the sense that something extraordinary had happened here and still lingered in the air. They spoke in low voices, referring to Emily's habits, her routine, the subtle details that had led to the eventual breakthrough. The city had moved on, but those who carried the case could not. DNA databases continued to evolve, technology refining itself in ways the original investigators had only dreamed of. But with each breakthrough, they remembered how fragile certainty had once been. One wrong assumption, one misread pattern, and decades could be wasted. The 1995 cold case had become an unspoken guideline, a reminder that persistence mattered more than haste, and that every small detail could tip the scales years later. Occasionally, journalists returned to the story, seeking anniversary pieces, retrospectives. They would interview detectives, prosecutors, and sometimes Emily's family, carefully balancing sensitivity with narrative. These pieces rarely satisfied public curiosity. They could not encapsulate 20 years of ambiguity, fear, and shifting truths, but they did keep the story alive, a cautionary tale of patience, persistence, and the human cost of error. The neighborhood, now generations removed from the original events, carried its own subtle imprint. Children played near spaces that had once been crime scenes. Parents kept watch for reasons that were never fully articulated. Locals who had been teenagers in 1995 still remembered, sometimes in whispered recollections, sometimes in nightmares, the events that had shattered the illusion of safety. The presence of memory, lingering and unspoken, was a shadow that refused to vanish. Mark Reeves' name continued to surface in legal circles, academic analyses, and cold case studies. He became a reference point, a cautionary example of both criminal behavior and investigative failure. Researchers examined the timeline, the DNA breakthrough, and the human errors that delayed resolution, using the case to teach persistence, humility, and skepticism. The story had transcended the personal tragedy. It became almost mythic in law enforcement culture, a warning that no case is ever too cold to revisit, and no truth is immune to time's distortions. At night, in the quiet of offices, bedrooms, and libraries, the same tension lingered. The understanding that the case was solved only in the legal sense. The emotional, psychological, and social consequences stretched far beyond verdicts and convictions. Closure existed unevenly, fragmented across those directly involved and those tangentially touched by the events. The cold case, despite being closed, had left traces that could not be erased. The most haunting fact remained. Emily's life was permanently absent, replaced by reconstruction, memory, and speculation. Even with Mark Reeves behind bars, the loss persisted, ineffaceable, a testament to the fragility of life and the persistence of justice delayed. Cold cases, the investigators knew, never truly die. They linger, they haunt, they inform every subsequent action, until time itself becomes a witness, carrying the echoes of lives interrupted and futures denied. Even with DNA, testimony, conviction, and law, the case remained alive in subtle ways. Shadows in old neighborhoods, hesitations in recollections, the quiet diligence of investigators, and the silent grief of families, all carried the residue of what had happened. Justice had been served in form, but the past, with all its fractures, persisted in essence, a reminder that the cost of truth is measured not only in verdicts but in the enduring silence left by those who can no longer speak for themselves. Years had passed since the conviction, yet the city carried the residue of Emily Carter's disappearance like a faint, persistent echo. Streets changed, neighbors moved, new children played in yards that had once been silent witnesses to tragedy, but the memory of 1995 remained embedded in the cracks of the sidewalks, the paint of the houses, the empty spaces where lives had once intersected. For those who had lived it, for those who had investigated it, the case was not a closed chapter. It was a wound stitched together with evidence, testimony, and the fragile threads of memory. Mark Reeves remained in prison, yet his presence lingered in subtle, unsettling ways. Detectives who had chased him across years of misdirection recalled the quiet persistence of a man who had existed on the edges, invisible yet observant, waiting for an opportunity that no one recognized until DNA brought it into sharp relief. They remembered the coffee cup he had mentioned unprompted, the fibers, the shadows glimpsed by a witness across the street. All details that became pieces of a puzzle assembled decades after the fact. In the halls of the department, his name was a cautionary tale. Persistence matters, but certainty can kill. Emily's family lived with a quiet vigilance that never fully dissipated. Even after the verdict, even after the law had acted, they could not recover what had been lost. They maintained small memorials, subtle acts of remembrance that marked a life stolen too soon. A flower left on a doorstep, a candle flickering in a window, a whispered memory in a quiet room. These acts carried weight that the courtroom could never contain. Justice, they understood, was never about closure alone. It was about acknowledgement, presence, and bearing witness to what could not be returned. Daniel Reeves continued his life under the shadow of wrongful accusation. Though cleared legally, the scars of public misidentification remained. He moved carefully through a world that had once labeled him guilty, understanding that reputation is fragile, that society rarely forgets the wrong story even after the truth is known. His experience became a private testament to the dangers of certainty, the ease of assumption, and the persistence required to reclaim one's own narrative. Investigators revisited the crime scene neighborhood occasionally, not for evidence but for perspective. The streets were familiar yet altered, the small changes reminding them that time moves relentlessly. Yet some memories refused to fade. They spoke in low tones about Emily's routine, the patterns they had observed, the small details that had ultimately led to Mark Reeves. Each conversation was a reminder of patience, the slow accumulation of evidence, and the delicate interplay between science, memory, and human error. The media, more cautious than during the first investigation, produced retrospectives that emphasized procedure, DNA breakthroughs, and the painstaking path to resolution. They avoided sensationalism, acknowledging decades of missteps, while highlighting the perseverance required to finally solve a cold case. Readers and viewers were reminded that justice is rarely immediate, that time can obscure as much as it reveals, and that truth, when delayed, carries consequences beyond any verdict. Yet even with legal resolution, the case remained emotionally unresolved. Mark Reeves' conviction did not restore Emily's life. It did not erase the years of fear, misdirection, or false accusation. It did not repair the fractured trust of neighbors or the burden carried by investigators. The verdict was a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, a technical correction in the ledger of justice, but the emotional landscape of the case remained rugged and uneven, defined by absence and lingering trauma. In the quiet of their offices, detectives often reflected on what the case had taught them: the fragility of memory, the fallibility of early assumptions, the danger of confirmation bias, and the unexpected power of science to illuminate decades-old truths. Each new cold case that arrived on their desks carried the weight of Emily Carter's story as a silent guide. Be thorough, be patient, respect evidence, and never underestimate the persistence of the past. Emily's life, though cut short, became a presence that shaped the future. Policies changed. Procedures tightened. Investigators trained in the lessons of the past, aware that a single overlooked detail could extend grief across decades. DNA testing evolved, databases grew, and every new breakthrough carried the shadow of 1995, a reminder that progress comes slowly and often painfully. At night, in the neighborhood where Emily had lived, the streets remained quiet, yet shadows seemed longer, pauses in conversation felt heavier, and memory seemed to hover over the houses. The cold case was officially solved, yet its impact remained active, threading through the lives of family, friends, investigators, and even those who had simply walked past the house that night without noticing. The truth had arrived, but it brought with it reverberations that would last far longer than the resolution itself. In the end, the story of Emily Carter and the decades-long pursuit of Mark Reeves served as a haunting testament to the cost of delayed justice. It was a reminder that time does not erase memory, that truth can arrive late but with undeniable force, and that the shadows of a cold case extend far beyond the courtroom, lingering in hearts, minds, and the quiet streets of a city forever changed. Even after the conviction, even after the legal system had acted, the case remained a cautionary tale. Cold cases can be solved, but the path to justice is never clean, never immediate, and never without a cost. The past speaks slowly, deliberately, leaving traces that refuse to be ignored, forcing all who remember to carry its weight, to reckon with its presence, and to understand that some truths once unearthed never fade entirely. The city sleeps, yet the echoes persist. Shadows of 1995 stretch across the streets, across decades, across the lives of those forever marked. Justice has arrived, but memory remains insistent, haunting, and unrelenting, a reminder that some stories are never truly over. The cold case was solved, the DNA had spoken, but the city, the neighborhood, the investigators, and the family all knew this. Some ghosts never leave, and the past never stops watching. Decades passed, but the story of Emily Carter refused to fade entirely. The house where she had lived became ordinary on the surface. A new family moved in, the lawn mowed, curtains drawn, children laughing in the yard. Yet to those who remembered, the walls held quiet testimony. Neighbors occasionally caught glimpses of shadows, pauses in movement. The inexplicable feeling that a past too sharp to fully vanish lingered in the air. The city itself seemed to carry her memory like a subtle hum beneath its streets. Mark Reeves grew older behind bars, his presence reduced to a number, a schedule, a series of entries in a database. He existed in routine and repetition, but the echoes of his past actions never left him completely. Investigators knew this instinctively. Someone like him carried memory, guilt, and awareness in ways that transcended confinement. The man who had moved invisibly through neighborhoods now moved invisibly through years. A ghost in a system he had once outwitted. In law enforcement, Emily's cold case became a permanent fixture of training. New detectives studied the files, the timelines, the subtle mistakes, and the small, almost invisible clues that had finally led to a breakthrough. The coffee cup, the hair, the shadows observed by witnesses decades before. Lessons were written in bold type. Patience, persistence, humility, and respect for memory. The case became more than investigation. It became a warning that every detail matters, and that time can both hide and reveal truth. Emily's family continued their quiet ritual of remembrance. Every year, a small ceremony, a flower left somewhere, a candle lit for a moment. They had learned that justice, even when achieved, does not erase absence. The court could not restore a life. It could not undo lost years, stolen innocence, or the fear and confusion endured. What remained was memory, active and persistent, a connection to a person who would never return. The neighborhood evolved. Streets were repaved, businesses came and went, children grew up and moved away. Yet older residents sometimes spoke in hushed tones about the events of 1995, sharing stories with those who had ears to hear. The lessons of vigilance, empathy, and attentiveness passed like folklore. And while the house no longer held the same tension it once did, the memory of that night, the absence of tomorrow, remained embedded in the collective consciousness. In criminal justice circles, the case persisted as a benchmark for cold cases. It demonstrated the power of forensic science, the dangers of early assumptions, and the importance of meticulous, unhurried work. New technologies, new databases, new methods of analysis were all evaluated in light of what had been discovered in 1995 and 2015. The city had learned slowly and painfully that the cost of ignoring evidence, or rushing conclusions, was not just legal but profoundly human. For the public, the story remained a cautionary tale. Retrospectives in newspapers and documentaries revisited the case periodically, emphasizing the lessons rather than sensationalizing the crime. The words "cold case solved" appeared, but with a caveat. Decades had passed, lives had been altered, and closure existed in pieces, never as a whole. Readers were reminded that truth can be delayed, that memory can be fragile, and that justice, when deferred, carries with it a heavy burden for all involved. Detectives sometimes returned to the streets quietly, walking the paths Emily had walked, observing what had changed and what remained. They thought about the shadows, the details that had mattered, the mistakes that could never be undone, and the small victories that had finally arrived. Their reflections were quiet, unspoken, but the weight of history was present with every step. They understood that a case closed could still resonate in ways the law could not contain. Even the media learned to tread carefully. Headlines were less sensational, articles more measured. Cold case decades later became a genre of reporting, not spectacle, honoring the persistence of investigators and the endurance of victims' families. The city read these stories with a kind of collective acknowledgement. recognizing that while justice may arrive late, the cost of delay is always paid in human lives, memory, and trust. Emily's absence, though permanent, shaped everything. It influenced policy, investigation techniques, family resilience, and community memory. Her life, though brief, became a lens through which law enforcement, journalists, and citizens understood vigilance, patience, and the persistent impact of crime on ordinary lives. The city had solved the cold case, but Emily remained, always, as the measure of what had been lost and the guide for what must never be ignored again. The shadows of 1995 stretched across decades, across streets, across memories. Mark Reeves' conviction had provided legal closure, but emotional, societal, and moral closure was more elusive. It had arrived partially, quietly, in fragments, echoes of truth, fragments of justice, traces of recognition. The past had spoken, slowly and deliberately, leaving behind a resonance that would never fade entirely. And so the city slept, the neighborhood moved on, the investigators continued their work, and Emily Carter's story endured. Not as a sensational headline, not as a cold case file, but as a persistent, unyielding reminder that some lives, though ended, shaped the world forever. The cold case had been solved, the DNA had spoken, the verdict had been delivered, yet the past, patient and deliberate, remained ever present, watching, teaching, haunting, and reminding everyone that truth, even when delayed decades, leaves a permanent mark. Decades beyond the courtroom, the story of Emily Carter had become part of the city's invisible architecture. Streets and houses changed, but echoes of that night persisted in ways small and unspoken. Teachers quietly recounted the case to students studying criminal justice, not as sensational story, but as instruction in patience, meticulous evidence handling, and the human cost of error. For every law enforcement lecture, every procedural review, Emily's life became a silent syllabus. Mark Reeves remained behind bars, older now, quieter, a shadow measured in routine and documentation. Yet investigators who had known him remembered his presence as something beyond incarceration, a reminder that the past carries weight long after legal matters are settled. His choices, his movements, and his silence had created ripples that stretched far beyond any cell. The years did not absolve him in memory. They magnified the consequences of his actions, embedding him into the collective consciousness of the city that had once ignored subtle warning signs. Emily's family, aging gracefully, continued their quiet acts of remembrance. Small flowers on doorsteps, candles in windows, soft prayers whispered in rooms no one else entered. Justice, they understood, had arrived formally, but it had not returned what was stolen. Their grief had evolved into a quiet vigilance, a moral presence that ensured Emily's absence was acknowledged in ways the law could not dictate. Memory became a form of resistance, a statement that she had existed and mattered. The neighborhood carried the story in its own subtle ways. Children born long after 1995 heard fragments of whispers from older residents, tales told in cautious tones about shadows, missing girls, and the persistence of investigators who refused to give up. The house where Emily had lived became both ordinary and sacred, ordinary to the new occupants, sacred in memory to the city that had witnessed tragedy and perseverance intertwined. Law enforcement continued to reference the case, decades later, as both a caution and a guide. Cold cases were handled with respect, every fiber of evidence preserved meticulously, every witness treated carefully. DNA databases were cross-checked, procedural checklists refined, and new officers reminded that a small oversight could extend grief for generations. The case became a silent teacher, informing every subsequent investigation in subtle ways. Even the media treated it differently. Anniversary reports focused less on lurid details and more on lessons learned, on the perseverance of investigators, on the ethical responsibility of law enforcement and journalism alike. The phrase cold case solved appeared often, but now it carried humility, acknowledging decades of lives disrupted, assumptions shattered, and patience required. The public learned slowly that truth is not always immediate, and that justice delayed, while painful, can leave an enduring imprint. Mark Reeves' presence in the system, though static, continued to influence the outside world. Criminal justice programs analyzed his behavior, the errors made by investigators, and the eventual breakthrough of DNA evidence. He became a case study in persistence, deception, and the long shadow a single individual can cast over a community. In textbooks and lectures, his name appeared alongside warnings. Respect time, respect evidence, respect memory, or the cost may be measured in decades of uncertainty. And yet, the most powerful presence remained Emily Carter, not as victim, not as statistic, not as headline, but as enduring memory. Her life, though brief, shaped policy, informed training, and molded the ethical consciousness of countless investigators, lawyers, and citizens. Every act of remembrance, public or private, served as a subtle insistence that the city acknowledge the human cost behind every file, every DNA sample, every cold case. Time moved forward, yet the cold case's impact was never fully in the past. It lingered in the quiet streets, in whispered conversations, in procedural reforms, and in the hearts of those who refused to forget. Justice and law had arrived decades later, but memory, vigilance, and moral reckoning persisted, ensuring that Emily Carter's story remained alive, instructive, and haunting, decades after the final verdict had been read. The city slept, yet the echoes of 1995 remained. Shadows stretched long over streets, houses, and neighborhoods. Investigators, families, and citizens alike carried fragments of the past with them, reminders that cold cases do not die. They evolve, persist, and quietly demand acknowledgement. The DNA had spoken. The verdict had arrived, yet the lessons of patience, consequence, and memory would never fade. Even now, more than 30 years later, the past watches, teaching, warning, haunting, insisting that no detail is ever truly forgotten, and that some truths once uncovered will reverberate indefinitely. The cold case was solved, but the human story behind it, like a shadow at dusk, stretched far beyond the reach of closure. By now, 35 years had passed since Emily Carter vanished. The city itself had grown, neighborhoods shifted, new streets and buildings erased the visible scars of the past. Yet the story of that summer night in 1995 persisted, woven into the subconscious of the community. It had become a whispered caution, a ghost story grounded in reality, reminding everyone that ordinary streets can hide extraordinary tragedy, that ordinary people can bear witness without fully understanding what they see. Emily's name was spoken less frequently in public, but it lingered quietly in law enforcement circles. Training academies referenced the case as a seminal example of the persistence of evidence, the dangers of bias, and the moral weight investigators carry. The tools had changed, DNA analysis more precise, databases vast, AI-assisted pattern recognition, but the lessons remained the same. The past was patient, unyielding, always present if investigators were attentive enough to notice. Mark Reeves had aged within the walls of the prison system. He became an almost mythical figure to criminal justice students. The man whose invisibility, patience, and elusiveness had prolonged grief for decades, until science finally revealed the truth. Prison psychologists, criminal profilers, and law enforcement instructors dissected his behavior, analyzing it for generations of lessons. He existed as both caution and study, a reminder that crime leaves reverberations far beyond immediate consequences. Emily's family had grown older, their grief softened by years but never erased. Small acts of remembrance continued. Flowers left quietly, letters read aloud to her memory, subtle acknowledgments in moments that would otherwise pass unnoticed. They had learned that justice, though important, is not sufficient to restore life. Memory, vigilance, and moral recognition were what kept her story alive, more powerful than headlines or verdicts. The neighborhood itself, transformed by time, remained haunted in ways ordinary eyes could not see. New families moved in, children played where silence had once fallen, but older residents recalled fragments, whispers, the subtle tension of a street that had known tragedy. The community had learned to balance normalcy with awareness, to respect what had happened without letting it dominate everyday life. Memory became a quiet architecture shaping behavior, empathy, and vigilance. Cold cases inspired by Emily's story became part of law enforcement doctrine. Investigators understood that time could conceal, that decades-old evidence could be decisive, and that persistence, careful documentation, and humility were critical. DNA breakthroughs, AI-assisted analytics, and international databases owed part of their philosophical foundation to lessons learned in this case. Emily's life had become a quiet driver of systemic reform. Media coverage, when it resurfaced, emphasized these lessons rather than lurid details. Documentaries and news retrospectives highlighted investigative perseverance, the moral obligations of public reporting, and the dangers of assumption. The phrase cold case solved became associated with resilience, patience, and ethical vigilance, a signifier of both scientific achievement and human responsibility. Even decades later, investigators occasionally returned to the streets. They walked slowly, observing ordinary details, the shift of sunlight on a sidewalk, the way trees cast shadows near corners, the subtle echoes of human movement. Every return reminded them that the past was never truly gone, that every decision, every missed clue, every careful observation mattered. Emily Carter's story persisted as a moral compass, reminding them that justice is as much about diligence as it is about law. The city itself seemed to absorb her presence. Public spaces, memorials, and local narratives carried fragments of her memory. Stories passed between generations, growing quieter but never entirely fading, creating an invisible thread that connected past to present. Her absence became a silent teacher, a warning that ordinary life can contain extraordinary consequences, that vigilance matters, and that truth, no matter how delayed, leaves permanent marks. Even with all the legal closure, the psychological and social echoes continued. Cold cases inspired by Emily's story were approached with reverence. Neighborhoods remained subtly watchful. Investigators carried caution and empathy into every subsequent case. Justice had arrived in law, but the ethical and emotional responsibilities stretched across decades, forever reminding those involved that some lessons cannot be taught without lived experience. And so the city slept, but shadows persisted. A quiet hum of memory moved through streets, alleys, and neighborhoods. The case had been solved. DNA had spoken. The verdict had been delivered. Yet Emily Carter's story, her absence, and the consequences of delayed justice remained. They were visible in vigilance, training, and memory, permanent, unyielding, haunting, ensuring that the past, patient and deliberate, continued to teach long after the law had spoken. The cold case was closed. The human story was still alive. It lingered in the city, in its streets, in its people, and in the quiet insistence that some truths once revealed echo far beyond the confines of courtrooms and